Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Baraza. I want to welcome our speaker, who is an alum of the University of Florida. Before I introduce them, I also want to remind everyone of an event coming up, and that's our Achebe Baldwin Symposium that starts the end of next week. It's Thursday and Friday. It's an entirely remote event with performances, writers, historians. So please look at our website to sign up. It's open to the public. If you want to invite your students, friends, family members, at any point over Thursday and Friday, we welcome your participation. We're going to be showing a film, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, which is an extraordinary film about Baldwin and the civil rights struggle. It hasn't been released to major audiences in over 30 years. And this entire event commemorates and interrogates Baldwin and Achebe's historic meeting. They've met only one time, and it was at UF in 1980. So we are revisiting that with historians, with writers. We have a student panel that asks questions about the Black graduate student experience at UF and the future of Blackness on campus. So lots of different things happening, and we really hope that you can take some time and be part of this. Our speaker today is Dr. S.M. Rodriguez. As I mentioned, they are a graduate of UF, so I'm particularly excited and pleased, and if you were here, we would certainly welcome you and fetch you and share your accomplishments, especially with our students, to let them know what they can do with their education and their career. Dr. Rodriguez is Director of LGBTQ Studies. She's a scholar activist and an assistant professor of sociology and criminology at Hofstra University in New York. They earned a PhD in 2016 at Stony Brook, following on an MA at Stony Brook and a BA at UF in 2010. So to me, that's just an impressive career already in terms of your accomplishments of earning that PhD so soon after you graduated from UF. Dr. Rodriguez's research interests as well as organizing efforts lie in justice movements that are by and for LGBTQ people of African descent. Their new book, The Economies of Queer Inclusion, was published in 2019, and it examines the dialectics of global and local culture and the effects of transnational financing on grassroots activism in Kampala. So congratulations on the new book. I know what a big effort it is to have one's first book out. I hope we have it in our library here. There are other recent publications: Carceral Protectionism and the Perpetually Invulnerable in Criminology and Criminal Justice, as well as a chapter entitled LGBTQ Politics in Africa in a book, Understanding Contemporary Africa. So it's just fantastic to have these new voices on the scene. Their talk today is entitled Imagining Transformative Justice in African LGBTI Politics. Thanks, and welcome back to UF.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm really excited to share with you all some of these thoughts. And well, we'll see. I don't want to jinx it. I'll probably keep it less than 45 minutes because I really do want to spend some time, extra time with that Q&A session, because the talk that I want to give today is based on the book, and it's based on what I found in my book, but really what I'm doing is I'm using my book as a springboard to have a connected conversation that is quite speculative. So I will say that, I'm an anti-violence organizer and theorist, and really my main questions really revolve around safety and life-affirming organizing for queer people of color. So just a little background with the book, The Economies of Queer Inclusion. Essentially around the time of the proposal of the anti-homosexuality bill in 2009, I started to look at the way that transnational media, transnational conversations and organizing were affecting local organizing in Kampala, Uganda. And really some of my main interests were essentially is transnational organizing serving the movement in a way that people who were involved in that activism were really hoping for. This took me to look at the different economies that were kind of created around movement making, around community organizing that transformed the grassroots into a very a multiplied kind of set of organizations and activists that were really striving for NGO status and status as nonprofits, and really following a very similar logic. Now, the talk that I'm going to give today is imagining transformative justice in African LGBTI politics. And with this, it's still really focused on transnational politics and how do we strengthen transnational politics so that it serves local movements greater and it serves what's happening or what the grassroots intends to happen in a way that is fulfilling and also anti-violent. So I am going to share my screen. And begin there. So this is the book cover, and it is there at University of Florida in the library. So you're more than welcome to check that out. If you're affiliated with other libraries and you're joining us today, then you can actually request it from your librarian. Right now, it is just out in hardcover. So really the best way to get it is through the libraries. But I will say that I do have excerpts available on my academia edu account, just excerpts though. So. In 2019, in November 2019, the LGBTQ Danger Index was published by a travel journalism website called Asher and Lyric. The site is an effort by a white heterosexual couple devoted to sharing their travel, packing, and safety advice. Using an index they created, the couple offered what they believe is a definitive, data-driven list of the worst and safest countries for LGBTQ plus travel in 2019. Accompanying this list is this map here, where the quote unquote highest danger countries are coded by Black coloring. Unsurprisingly, the vast majority of African countries are Black. The color scheme of the Americas appears inverted. Western and Northern Europe, along with Australia, the birthplace of one of the authors, are all brightly colored, somewhere between an inviting pink and a purple. A glimpse at the data collected reveals that the index was created with just 8 factors in mind, none of which had included whether or not LGBT travelers or even residents were harassed, attacked, or killed, whether or not travelers felt safe, whether or not they had fun or made friends while traveling or discovered gay-friendly hangouts. Rather, factors that have genuinely nothing to do with tourism, travel, or short-term stays were prioritized and ranked. In order of their listing, the variables appeared as 1, legalize same-sex marriage. 2, worker protections. 3, constitutional and broad protections against discrimination. 4, the criminalization of violence. 5, joint and/or second parent adoption recognition. 6, whether or not a Gallup poll reported if it was a good place to live. 7, if same-sex relationships are illegal. And 8, which they just called propaganda or morality laws. Quite obviously then, a neoliberal rights-based framework informed the sense of safety or danger for these heterosexual couples. Rather than produce a guide that could actually expose recent queer-led safety interventions or community building efforts, or even attacks, assaults, etc., the authors decided to reproduce a homo-nationalist claim and a demarcation where countries with more melanin are unabashedly coded Black, matching the Black word worst in the headline. However, perhaps less than obvious is the way in which this reproduction leads certain bodies into spaces of constant harm, erases the existence and struggle of or resilience of those who navigate persistent danger in the environments cheerfully coded pink and purple. And by this, I am calling attention to the United States in particular, where queer asylum seekers constantly and unsuccessfully attempt to find safety, where they are actually immediately detained and held in private-run carceral facilities, detention centers, or where recorded homicide against queer and trans people of African descent actually outnumbers any other country. In a homo-nationalist political paradigm, a nation state incorporates select LGBT citizens into its imagined character through a process of normativization, as explained by Jasbir Puar in 2007, with readiness defined in the case of the United States as proximity to whiteness, middle and high socioeconomic status, physical and mental ability, and binary gender performance. A simple matter of legislative changes absorbs those most readily available into the identity of the nation. These legislative changes lift the barriers often recognized in a mainstream gay rights agenda: access to marriage equality, access to military service and other employment, and access to the protections of the criminal legal system. Here, I very specifically say LGBT and not LGBTQ or even I, instead of queer, because as states begin to accept lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender personhood and bodies that best align with the normate rather than queer personhood, which is identified as an active or political rejection of social norms. Importantly, homo-nationalism is used to differentiate states by a gay rights metric and reinforce the economic, militaristic, and cultural domination of the West over the rest of the world. Homo-nationalism both racializes the homophobic nation and then uses such racialization to naturalize the supposed connection between progress and whiteness. Contemporarily, critiques of an African wave of homophobia have erupted to paint a Black diaspora in a broad backward stroke. With political, economic, and racialization informed analyses to nuance, problematize, and push back on this perspective, one can locate the cultural and panic-based impetus to legislate against LGBT advancement in a reactive desire for sovereignty and dignity in a homo-nationalist time. The global neoliberal regime of punishment is doomed to fail in supporting the dignity of queer people in the countries that have adopted anti-gay laws, because the servant, isolation, sanction process embraced by neoliberal foreign powers perpetuates necropolitical and carceral logic rather than transforms it. Parallel to this failure is the ultimate failure of the punitive carceral efforts applied to the individuals who enact anti-gay harm. One second. Okay. In this talk, I'd like to propose a speculative project of imagining a transformative politic in transnational LGBTI advocacy, one that centers African principles and the efforts made by LGBTI people of African descent throughout the diaspora. In order to do this, I'll outline some key issues with the retributive justice system and carceralism, particularly by highlighting how it is globalized and used for even liberal or progressive change. I'm also relying on Achille Mbembe's explanation of necropolitics, which is the use of political, social, and economic power to dictate how particular people must die in order to sustain the political, social, and physical life of others. So why am I framing this as carceral? To begin, transformative justice practitioners and thinkers put forward how the logics of labeling, retribution, and surveillance embedded in the practice of criminalization do not reorient the motivation or transform the conditions that inspire people to commit harm. Anti-carceral and abolitionist theorists have offered the foundational arguments on why violence begets violence rather than fixes it. By carceral or carceralism, what I'm pointing to is the use of particular systems or particular methods like labeling and surveillance or isolation to further punitive institutions and ideologies. A significant portion of studies on carceral feminism or anti-carceralism really identify how much our penal systems are kind of embedded in our minds and the ways that we think about how to respond to harm or how to respond to violence or a lack of safety. Put simply, I'm arguing that labeling and enacting legislative violence on Black and Brown countries and communities only further entrenches the motivations for anti-queer harm. So there are 5 different objectives that are usually identified for a criminal justice system. The 2 that we rely on the most, or that scholars argue that we rely on the most, are really retribution and incapacitation. Now, both of these objectives rely on the idea that there are certain bodies in our society, in any society, that are essentially disposable to that society. So retribution is when one furthers the punishment or enacts measured punishment in response to harm. And incapacitation is really when you remove someone from a general public so that they can no longer harm that general public. And that removal is achieved through maiming, through permanent isolation, so like life imprisonment, or through death. So the normative rhetoric of justice, that which has been mainstreamed globally since European colonialism, really favors 2 particular forms: justice as conceived as rights, and justice conceived as retribution administered through courts and state-sanctioned action. The priorities of the LGBT rights movements, therefore, really have focused on that ability to gain state recognition and protection through the criminal justice system. Now, not to spend too much time on the others, but I will say that deterrence is taken 2 different ways. It can be individualized. So it means that like stopping someone who has committed some type of transgression from doing it again. Or it can be generalized, which is when the system uses punishing an individual to kind of communicate to others that they should not engage in committing a similar harm. Restorative justice or restoration holds the underlying belief that people who have committed harm can either realize that and change, or they can right their wrongs. Rehabilitative, the rehabilitative objective essentially pathologizes harm doing. So it points to underlying issues that it then says those issues cause the harm. So addiction, for example, or mental illness, and then it seeks to fix that. Now I'm going to focus on retribution and incapacitation in this argument because essentially these aspects, these kind of carceral logics, are logics that aren't just applied in our own society here in the United States, but they're globalized. And I mean that in two different ways. One being essentially the way Opara uses it, which is that many other societies have embraced norms of a punitive regime, and so they similarly construct detention centers, prisons, jails, etc. But the way that I'm looking to globalize it in this argument is to say that in a world system, there are countries that take up the responsibility, essentially, of enacting carceral methods on weaker states. So in the world system, this would be how the core treats the semi-periphery or the periphery after it's identified that that nation has done some type of legislative harm. What I find in my book is that rather than understanding the Ugandan anti-homosexuality bill in its context, which is really an attempt at sovereignty, and anti-imperialism in the context of global economic and political marginalization. Rather than thinking of it that way and then saying, how do we get to the root of this issue and kind of change things so that a country like Uganda doesn't take up the need to enact further anti-gay laws. I think I disappeared for a second. Here we are. Instead, the country really took the opportunity to kind of flex the arm of its punitive global regime, right? So like the criminal justice system, the way that states speak to each other can rely on this logic that a superior violence will quell smaller instances of violence. So if economic sanctions, for example, can deprive your entire populace of critical health measures, you'll end your deprivation of this subset of your population's personal liberties, right? So it's a threatening, right? Sanctioning kind of takes up a position of threat in this order. So how does this connect to African LGBTI politics? In July 2015, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that same-sex couples would be able to legally marry in all states. In the wake of that ruling and the waves of excitement by lesbian, gay, and bisexuals throughout the world, an image that recreated the iconic Iwo Jima photograph began to circulate the internet. In response, Fox News immediately hosted a segment heatedly debating its creation as problematic or unpatriotic. For Fox News, this was a desecration of an important moment and a symbol of American righteousness. For many advocates for social justice in the United States, including anti-war, anti-violence, or anti-nuke activists of the civil rights movement and post-civil rights movement, this image symbolizes war and the dominance of American imperialism. It's taken within the same month that over 25,000 American and Japanese troops died, and it's taken shortly before the United States used atomic bombs to kill roughly 200,000 Japanese civilians. The radiation from those bombs still cause birth defects and cancers today. The reproduction of this image with 4 masculine, gender binary conforming men with a rainbow flag after the ruling of same-sex marriage left a really bitter taste in my mouth for a very different reason than the patriotic Republican broadcaster. For one reason, this photograph accompanies the realization that the mainstream gay rights movement has produced a white gay corpus that has no regard for the intersections through which American activists before have organized, including the transgender and gender nonconforming people of color who began the Stonewall riot that sparked the gay rights movement here, or is credited with sparking the gay rights movement in this country. It's also interestingly reminded me of a really interesting event that I had noticed a year before. An organic ice cream shop owner in Marin County, California, one of the richest counties in the United States, traveled to Uganda to mount a flag in Margarita Peak. He declared to President Museveni in a note, "Your country's highest point is no longer its soil, its snow, or a summit marker, but rather a gay pride flag waving brilliantly." Later in the same letter, he states the following: "In a country that is dependent on the United States to fund the majority of its HIV/AIDS care, where less than 5% of those with cancer have access to treatment, and where those with access to electricity are still a small minority of the populace, does it make sense to devote precious and limited resources to imprison those who should be free?" End quote. His exposition interweaves really important signifiers of homonationalism. First, those most privileged within a nation perpetuate homonationalism, as their capital provides access to not only travel when and where desired as middle and upper class Americans, but to also unapologetically and apathetically remind others of their relative poverty and to reinforce dependency as the more dominant nation sees fit. Second, these nationals uphold American exceptionalism in gay rights claims, as the United States only overturned its own federal sodomy legislation in 2003. In order to do this, there has to be a thorough dehistoricization of both American and world history. His entire demonstration rested on the premise that Uganda should not attempt to imprison, quote unquote, those who should be free, not realizing that the life imprisonment penalty that he protests against was enacted in 1990, 24 years before the Anti-Homosexuality Act was passed. It was also nullified that year. The extension of anti-sodomy legislation to life imprisonment went without much outcry by Americans at that point because the nascent homonationalist political paradigm hadn't been adopted. Homonationalism upkeeps righteous American imperialism, thereby entitling a man to stake a flag literally occupying Ugandan land. His statement that his arrival marks the day that Uganda cannot even claim that anything Ugandan was the height of the nation symbolically marks the neo-colonial repertoire upon which homonationalism builds. He adds in a simple statement that if you don't like said flag on your highest peak, I urge you to climb up and take it down, knowing that his privileges as a white American, able-bodied, rich man would provide him impunity, even as he flies halfway across the world to declare gay identities as belonging in a land that he'd likely never visit anyways. In chapter 4 of the book, I show how homonationalism and transnational advocacy alter local dynamics of sexual justice organizing. I argue that a new local economy is created when Ugandan organizers integrate themselves into the US-based or UN-centered transnational advocacy structure. This economy is a microstructure created by 4 national and international level steps. First, core states create a global gay superstructure that demarcates progressive societies from quote unquote primitive societies. Second, the US-based transnational advocacy structure embeds itself in the superstructure as they enact watchdog methods. working primarily with Black and Brown nations of the quote-unquote global South, rather than the vast criminalization and human rights abuses created by and enacted upon their own nations. Then local activists in various peripheral nations apply to fit within the transnational structure in order to gain funding. Using interviews with 15 organizations working with or within Uganda, I find that this arrangement led not only to a lot of factionalization, so instead of being, let's say, the original three LGBT organizations that really started to pop up around 1990, or 1999, and thrived at that time. By 2009, so about 10 years later, there were somewhere around 24 organizations. So that factionalization did a lot of disservice to the movement. But what happens with that global structure is essentially that it affirms those who were claiming that they were combating homosexuality in order to fight imperialism, which there is a chapter on homophobic nationalism that is actually available. So if anybody would like it, just let me know. That shows how the underlying anxieties that led to the anti-homosexuality bill were economic tensions and tensions about global technologies that were essentially undermining the state. So homo nationalism actually aligns with militarism and regimes of punishment. Therefore, it can't serve to undermine state-based criminalization efforts and extra-legal punishment. If one were guided by an anti-carceral approach, then the specific argument that arises, or actually there would be a sustained movement to eradicate the death penalty, or life imprisonment, or responding to harms through a criminal justice system that enacts disproportionate violence on very specific bodies. That has the potential of being a much more efficacious anti-violence strategy and comprehensive anti-violence strategy than choosing certain bodies to protect in a moment where those punishments like life imprisonment or the death penalty are threatened to be applied to those specific bodies. So how does carceralism compromise safety? It's unevenly applied. It's applied according to social capital, and it emphasizes the disposability of certain, or of the majority of people, bodies of African descent, while it shows that other people, more valued people, don't actually need to be accountable. Now, what do I mean by that? In a Ugandan context, this might look like looking at sexual violence more comprehensively and seeing the ways in which certain actions of sexual violence are unlikely to be met with any type of accountability method. So, well, I won't get into specifics of certain criminalized actions unless you'd like to talk about it, but essentially actions such as defilement actually make up the majority of criminalized sexual violence instances in Uganda. And yet the Minister for Ethics and Integrity naturalizes that and says that, well, essentially heterosexual rape, even of a young person, is the natural or normal order of things. And therefore it makes sense to actually target those who engage in what they criminalize as sodomy or same-sex sexual practices with someone who is vulnerable because of their age. So if we're looking at this uneven application in a general sense outside of sexual violence, then what we're looking at essentially is in a context of racial difference, social capital is assigned via a racial hierarchy, meaning that people who are engaging in harm are unlikely to be punished for that harm that they're engaging in based on a racial delineation. In countries that are homogenous racially, even if multi-ethnic, then social capital might be aligned more so with economics or with, well, I'll just stay with that, with class. So that disposability actually creates a significant issue with not just people who are immediately affected by it, but with community members who are identifying with those who are being disposed of. So namely, the people who are marginalized because of sexuality, of gender, or of their class. Now, the politics of punishment and isolation actually have counter-deterrent effects, meaning that while we often, I say we, and what I mean here is society on a whole tends to embrace penal attitudes, right? So if someone does something violent and harms someone else, then a default reflex might be to then apply that superior violence, that being either vigilante or extra-legal violence or through the state. It is common for people to want to see those who have enacted harm be harmed. We want to see a tough sentence on someone who breaks the law, right? But the politics of punishment actually is found to have counter-deterrent effects, meaning that it doesn't actually stop people from harming others because it does nothing to address the root cause or the issue, the reason why that harm was done. What in our social structure enabled violence in that case? Instead, these punitive attitudes really lead people, or not punitive attitudes, but retribution in and of itself leads people to, who are being punished, to kind of take the punishment and measure whether or not they can take that punishment or make a rational choice about whether or not to engage in that harm. Is engaging in this harm worth the punishment that I'll serve? Right, and this is the reason why we see things like recidivism being very high in a retributive justice system. Now, transformative justice describes a system of responses to violence that relies on community and civil leadership, especially of those most impacted by violence, to identify and transform the root causes of harm. All right, so it names these underlying causes, and it looks at addressing what those underlying issues are. It also centers the knowledge and the experience of the most marginalized or the most vulnerable to harm, asking, you know, how do you transform this context so that this form of harm doesn't happen in the future? Or if it does happen in the future, how do we equip people to address it without resorting to a quote unquote superior violence? So that carceral, underlying carceral logic, right? Transformative justice also breaks us away from false binaries. So we have a central mythology in a punitive system that says some people are criminals and some people are law-abiding. If I ask now, you know, how many of you identify as criminal or how many of you identify as law-abiding, there's a good chance most people would say law-abiding, right? And yet we all have committed crimes, particularly if you're past the age of criminal culpability, you're an adult. Means that you haven't abided by all laws. So what is the truth that actually divides those who are criminal from those who are law-abiding? More often than not, it's actually social capital. On a national level, this false binary is the one that I was describing earlier. So the idea that there is the progressive or safe country versus the barbaric or the dangerous country. And that's really what homo-nationalism is attempting to do, and homo-nationalist arguments attempt to do, is kind of reaffirm that people who are outside of African nations are safer, right? And the data doesn't hold up in that way. So in part, the reason why, going back to the original map that I showed you of Asher, that the Asher and Lyric website produced, and other nationalist arguments of queer safety, the reason why they fail is really due to this kind of scalar issue. Nations and nation level data are fundamentally unable to remark upon the reality of queer danger, especially when you're looking into former settler colonies that are marked by significant racial segregation. So like the purple-coated United States, South Africa, Brazil, etc. When you have these, so the more stark inequality is within the nation, the less reliable the data will be around what types of harm are really occurring, right? How is the criminal justice system doing? And we see this by seeing the misalignment between national rhetoric of safety with things like victimization data. So how does transformative justice increase safety? Transformative justice seeks to humanize harm doing while also stressing accountability. So it says we all commit harm. We all are capable of transgression, and we've all done this in some way, shape, or form. So it stresses accountability by teaching us, what do you do after you have committed harm? What do you do after you have done something violent, for example? Now, I know that this language in and of itself might feel very hard to hear. Sometimes our instinct when personalizing violence is to really reject it. But I want to emphasize that everybody is capable of violence, and violence is something that many people enact consistently if they haven't been accountable, if they haven't really thought about how they've harmed people in their lives. So humanizing harm doing in this sense, if we're scaling it up to a nationalist scale, would really look through, for example, how has the United States, which is being held up as a progressive or safe, and you know, bear in mind that I did write this before during 2020, politics really took hold, but that says, you know, this is a marker of civilization, of progress, that has all of these rights, that treats people well, et cetera, and in doing so really forgets the susceptibility, the vulnerability to harm that queer people of African descent have in this country, but also the very recent histories even of, well, I won't say recent history, I'll say the very current reality of applying punishment disproportionately to people of African descent, including queer people of African descent. So what does it mean to talk about safety in this country, or talk about progress in this country, and then simultaneously have data that tells us that Black trans women, for example, the majority have had hostile encounters with the state, with police in this case, or the disproportionate likelihood that trans people have served time in prison or jails, right? So experiencing violence, experiencing harm of the state, also an increased susceptibility to vigilante violence or violence done by people outside of the state. What would it mean to humanize harm doing? What would it mean to say, we've been in this position and we are in this position and we have taken accountability for the harms that we do against people of African descent, rather than pointing out, isolating, and enacting a regime of surveillance against countries that forces this country to label African nations as other, in order to then justify regimes of harm, economic harm, for example, that this country engages in when it continues neoliberal policies, for example, that really control how the government can service or provide for their people. So transformative justice could increase safety by minimizing statist solutions and avoiding violent institutions. One, transformative justice is the justice system that avoids criminalization, avoids languages and logics of criminalization and carceralism. So rather than labeling people according to criminal lines, it instead says, how do we make sure that forms of harm that this person is experiencing, they're not experiencing from me, right? They're not experiencing from my government, from my representative, from my community, from my neighbor, from my parent, etc. So that root, identifying issues at the root, like I said. The word just left me, so bear with me there. But if you look at something very specific, I guess, right? Transformative justice through community-based approaches are actually able to develop culturally relevant strategies. All right, so rather than thinking of nationalist approaches or a global approach that's then kind of mapped on to different countries, such as we see with a lot of UN-centered international NGOs, community-based solutions could be shared transnationally. They could be, we could have communication between the brilliant organization, Sexual Minorities Uganda, for example, and JFLAG, which is a queer organization in Jamaica, right? And have these conversations throughout the diaspora. So lastly, what I move into in order to look at transformative justice in action and how these strategies or these approaches can be shared is the focus of chapter 5 in the book, Centering Afro-Diasporic Organizing. And I look at 4 different types of organizing, one being I activism. Now, I activism is a strategy embraced by the Safe Outside the System collective, which is a collective of the Audre Lorde Project, an anti-violence collective. This is a community organization that says that queer organizing needs to be abolitionist, ancestral, interdependent, and transformative. And really understands those first 3 as constituting a transformative movement. But there's also organizations of African, led by people of African descent, or throughout the African diaspora that are focusing on Indigenous healing networks and accessibility to wellness. There is community accountability, like I said, that's growing actually globally. And then there's also community security methods. So the very real question of when I'm facing harm in this environment, in this event, in this meeting, etc., what do I do to de-escalate that? And how do I do that without involving violence workers? Those are the workers of the state that stress carceral responses. So I'm actually gonna just leave that there. I invite questions that have to do with the book and kind of background information, or that have to do with kind of the movement that I'm suggesting here that really embraces a transformative future. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take questions now. You've got a question from Octavio Gomez. Go ahead, Octavio.
Hello, Dr. Rodriguez. Thank you for your presentation. It was very informative. I think I do agree with the general formulation of kind of the cultural hegemonic influence that the United States and other developed nations have on kind of the African continent, other developing countries as a whole. But I was thinking of playing maybe a bit of a devil's advocate here, but I also feel like this formulation also gives a pass to, let's say, like religious fundamentalists in Uganda who have explicitly and vehemently like pushed for kind of these anti-LGBTQ policies. And I was just thinking kind of how you would kind of engage with, you know, the actors who have perpetuated these laws and created these things in kind of a transformative way. I think that personally, like, you know, we can both acknowledge the crimes of like American imperialism and like homo-nationalism, as you say, but I also think that I feel like I'll get to that in a little bit, but also I'm just wondering, like, what do you think the alternative is to like a multilateral approach to dealing with like human rights abuses and stuff like that? And how would you go about restoring like people that you would legitimately consider like human rights abusers? And I guess that's my overall question.
Thank you. That is such a phenomenal question. And it takes a layer that I actually wanted to give to this talk, but I was like, this is going to be a 3-hour talk if I do this. So thank you. Thank you so much for asking that. Does this give a pass to anti-gay activists? Now, I say activists because there was a very concerted and comprehensive collective of people who really spurred this issue in terms of instigating the anti-homosexuality bill. And so I want to thank you for bringing them into that conversation. How do we hold these types of leaders accountable? So the idea with transformative politics really is one that would support connection making so that people don't feel the need to extend this type of violence in the future. And so there are a few things that I think are possible with religious leaders. One, the religious leaders were supported by citizens. I think a huge part that is omitted in the conversations that came out about what was happening in the anti-homosexuality bill was just how multi-layered the support was for the anti-homosexuality bill. Once religious leaders were, galvanizing, there were galvanizing support amongst religious communities. There were also the parliamentarians, and then there were the citizens themselves who were looking to push forward with this law. Now, the thing is that the rhetoric behind why they supported it would hold no real basis if anyone actually addressed those key issues. And so what were the key issues? One, they were terrified that the most impoverished citizens and the youngest citizens were being exploited by unlimited amounts of money that were being siphoned in, right? And this is imagined, into queer organizing in Uganda. So how would a transformative politic approach this? It would look at how does exploitation and vulnerability because of poverty, how can we ameliorate that situation? How could we make sure that people actually had what they needed so that they didn't feel like people were vulnerable to harm specifically because they had economic needs? So I think that's the biggest part with that, is kind of thinking through how do you make it so that this situation doesn't happen again. Our key failure, or a key failure internationally with approaching this with punitive logic immediately, and by that I mean these people were labeled human rights abuser. There were people that were campaigning so that those religious leaders couldn't come into the United States. Things like that were happening before thinking through what are they saying and why. And what we ended up seeing was a mushrooming of anti-gay legislation as a response outside of Uganda. So I think it's really important to kind of think through what are the larger implications and how do norms spiral, especially outside of the core powers onto peripheral powers.
Okay, we're ready for another question or comment, unless you want to follow up, Octavio.
No, I thought that was a great answer. Thank you so much.
Okay, does anyone else have a question or comment? Brenda, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I do. Thank you for the talk. You introduced a lot of new ideas and terms to me. And I think this is tied a bit to what Octavio mentioned. I'm really curious to hear more about the way in which these transnational organizations attempting to perhaps empower and work with local organizations in Uganda. It sounded like that these objectives kind of got subverted and that it kind of destabilized some of the local solidarities and their agendas. So what's the best way to go about enabling some kind of transnational activism? Or is the fact of the matter that if it comes from the global north, it just is kind of overwhelming and not really allowing the kinds of self-determination that are so critical here? So maybe you can just share a little bit more on that.
Thank you for that question. So the international organizations, and I look at two different types of international organizing efforts. UN-centered advocacy, right, which are very, there's like a standardized way, right? There's a methodology that they embrace. and a more creative kind of network of people who are working transnationally, who are doing activism, you know, from their computers, or they are doing activism with fundraising, et cetera, right? And so I look at these two different, I call them generations of organizing, transnational advocacy methods. And there are a few things that kind of persist with that. One, the central conversation often is about money and getting money or giving money with very particular types of aims. Now, whether with the kind of UN-centered organizations or these independent activists, a lot of time, what people were primarily concerned with was whether or not the organization that was asking for help or the individuals asking for help were legitimate. And by that, they meant legitimately gay or queer, which I found really interesting. I have a few anecdotes about that in the book, where, you know, I was asked to make sure that a couple was the real deal kind of thing before they deserved the money or they deserved help. Now, on the scale of an international organization, this looks like how well are they writing grants, grant applications, and particularly in those grant applications, how are they explaining that their methods of organizing are effective, right? So there's very much like this approach where activists need to explicitly state that they are going to use help in order to sustain their activism and somehow make a great effect in a way that this international sphere really understands. And there are only very specific forms of activism that are legible in that language of grant writing. And so, yes, those international organizations, some of them really did destabilize the local scene. And some of this was because the central focus on money really caused a lot of competition to arise, which was very hard for grassroots organizations that didn't necessarily want to be integrated into this like nonprofit structure, or they didn't know how to do that. And the lack of transparency around money. So the central issue of where does this funding flow? If you follow like Lisa Dugan's approach to how neoliberal activism works, it's essentially that the funding, the money, the status, etc., it all kind of circles back to those who were in power in the first place. And those organizations had essentially that effect, right? It takes so much money just to sustain salary in the United States, right? Working transnationally. So if this person's getting $100,000 and then the organization is funding a Ugandan organization at the rate of, say, $10,000 spread over 5 years, you can see that the majority of the fundraising is actually going to just reconstitute the economic power that was originating in the United States. Now, I don't frame that as a global North issue necessarily, because I don't like to work specifically through that level. I like to engage more in communities, and I like Mbembe's idea of the death world because I think that it connects spaces or regions transnationally that wouldn't otherwise be connected. I think there's much more in common with those who, queer folks in East New York, Brooklyn, and queer folks in Kampala, Uganda, than there are with within the nation or within the global North. So, for example, people in that area in Brooklyn are not going to connect to, we'll say even a typical kind of Manhattanite. Those are very different worlds. And so what I'm arguing is that there's actually more connection if you analyze it on the death world kind of through that lens. Yeah.
Thanks. Do we have another question or comment?
I'll just add with that, because I ended with that language of the death world, that my outlook isn't a pessimistic one. It's not necessarily to say that this is where people are going to stay or anything like that, or that death is all we have to look forward to or anything like that. It's really to kind of identify the place that people are working from when we're persistently fighting for our lives. But to say that life affirming organizing is only coming out of places where people are constantly confronted with death.
So you know that Puar has this other concept of bio-necro collaboration, and it's actually pretty interesting because it doesn't just kind of redeploy Mbembe, but it also looks at kind of the mixing of life and death. And I almost think what you're saying is how these groups can come together that may both be kind of marginalized, but how does that kind of create new possibilities, new energy by kind of a shared exclusion or suffering. So that might actually allow you to kind of pry some of those other possibilities out in interesting ways.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's about the synergy. It's not about the idea that those contexts are exactly the same, right? You know, so which is why I appreciate that conversation about collaboration.
Thanks.
Okay, we have a few minutes left. Anyone else with a comment or a question for our presenter? All right, last call. If not, I'd definitely say thank you, and it's great to have an alum back, even just virtually in Gainesville. Thanks very much for your talk today.
Thank you so much for having me. I actually just noticed, and I didn't intend this at all. This is the cup that I was drinking out of. So here we are, go Gators. Thank you for having me back.
All right, thank you.